How did a guy living in Ontario come to host a daily Boston Bruins podcast? Let's get into it.
You're Locked On Bruins, your daily podcast on the Boston Bruins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Bruins fans, and welcome back to the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. I'm your host, Ian McLaren, and this is a daily show where we discuss all things Spoked B. Today is Thursday, August 1st, and I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Bruins part of your daily routine. Free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Now, as we are in the dog days of summer, we're waiting for Jeremy Swayman to sign a contract, waiting for training camp to start, waiting for some PTOs perhaps to be signed, or a scoring winger on the cheap. Today, I wanted to talk about my Bruins origin story and how I came to host this podcast and what's next in the history of this show. Before we get into that, a quick reminder, you can find the podcast on social media at Locked NHL Bruins, and you can find me, my hockey thoughts, dad jokes at Ian C. McLaren. Now, as I've discussed on the podcast before, and even with my dad who was on a few years ago, the reason I'm a Bruins fan, while having been born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, being raised in Ottawa, and now living in Guelph, which is about an hour west of Toronto, it all goes back to my dad, who, growing up in Trenton, Ontario, which is about an hour east of Toronto, he became a huge Bobby Orr fan. Bobby Orr, of course, played for the Oshawa Generals before moving up to the Boston Bruins, Oshawa being a short distance from Trenton. Everybody was captivated by Bobby Orr, and back then, of course, there was limited options when it came to viewing, so Bobby Orr, the Boston Bruins, regularly featured on Hockey Night in Canada, and my dad was hooked, even watching games with my grandma as Bobby Orr was coming up. So that was a huge impetus as to why I became a Boston Bruins fan. The other part of that is, as a young boy, 9-10 years old, the Bruins reached the Stanley Cup Final in 1990. Their first finals appearance in my lifetime. I was born in late 1980, for context. 1990, the Bruins took on the Edmonton Oilers. And at the time, my sister, who's 7 years older than I am, she was a huge Marc Messier fan, loved the Edmonton Oilers, and then the New York Rangers after that. And she was obviously rooting hard for the Oilers. So because of that Bobby Orr connection with my dad, and because I wanted to be a good, annoying little brother, I dug deep into my Bruins fandom at that point, and it never faded from there. It just latched on and kept growing. Of course, the Bruins lost that series against the Edmonton Oilers in 1990, but again, my fandom at that point was secured, locked in, and just kept growing from there. And as it turns out, that Bruins team was pretty good. They went on the next season to win the President's Trophy, best record in the NHL in 1991. And unfortunately, despite advancing to the conference finals, they bumped into a very good Pittsburgh Penguins team that featured Mario Lemieux, Jaromir Jagr, others, and they lost in the semifinals. In fact, they would go on to bump up against those Penguins a couple times and were not able to get past them in 1991 or 1992. Again, just very, very good Pittsburgh Penguins teams that the Bruins lost to in back-to-back conference finals. They lost in 6 games in 90. They lost in a sweep in 91, lost in a sweep in 92, and then it was a bit of a downswing from there. They did not reach the conference finals again for quite some time. They did trade for Adam Oates in 1992, who became one of the most productive centers in Bruins history, formed a potent duo with my favorite player as a youngster, who is Cam Neely, current team president, of course. And that fandom, that legend was sealed during the 1993-94 season, where Cam Neely scored 50 goals in just 49 games, which is, I mean, apart from that Stanley Cup final appearance, conference final appearances were great. Disappointing, of course, but watching Cam Neely score 50 goals in 49 games, that just locked it in for me. I was transfixed. I was amazed. And it was around that time as well that I got my first and only stitched Bruins jersey, which has the number 8 on the back. And yeah, I'm not a huge jersey guy, but I wanted that one. And that's what I wear whenever I go to Bruins games now. Now, things kind of ebbed a bit in 1996 when the Bruins' streak of 29 playoff appearances ended in 1996-97. It was one of the longest streaks in NHL history, but it proved to be a real down point for the Boston Bruins. They had lost in the first round the previous year to the Florida Panthers, who we'll touch on later here on the podcast. They lost 5 games. The Panthers went to the final that year against Colorado. They did not qualify, and that led to some down years for the Bruins, but it also opened the door for the first overall pick and kind of the next evolution in my Bruins fandom, and we'll discuss that here as the podcast continues. Now, I'm a big believer in the Game Time app, and I've used it a few times to buy tickets to baseball games and concerts near me. They're an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball, and then they make getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They have amazing last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and a low price guarantee, taking all the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets, but also concerts, theater, comedy near you as well. All you have to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Game Time, last-minute tickets at the lowest price guaranteed. Thank you so much once again for making Locked On Bruins part of your daily routine. Free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. While you're on YouTube, check out Locked On Sports Today. All the latest news, opinions, and analysis from across the Locked On universe 24/7 on YouTube. It's a free channel called Locked On Sports Today. It's also available on the Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we talked about how I became a Bruins fan, how it peaked with those finals appearances, conference finals appearances, Cam Neely scoring 50 and 49. Reached the down point in 96-97 when the Bruins failed to make the playoffs, but they were awarded the number 1 overall pick, where they drafted Joe Thornton. He became a key player for the Boston Bruins before being traded in 2005. We'll touch on that later. But to get him, Sergei Samsonov in the same draft. Samsonov, of course, went on to win the Calder Trophy that year. Remarkable additions for the Bruins. Now, after missing the playoffs, they had They qualified the next 2 years, but in 99, 2000, and 2001, those were very down years for the Boston Bruins, and it led to the trading of longtime captain Ray Bourque to the Colorado Avalanche. He wanted to finish his career on a high note. Didn't look like it was going to happen in Boston, and rightfully so. They were among the low teams in the league and failed to qualify for the playoffs in 2000. Did not qualify in 2001. And so they decided to trade Ray Bourque to the Colorado Avalanche. It wasn't just a rental situation, though. He came back, played an entire season with the Avs, and won the cup with them in 2001. It was bittersweet. I loved seeing Ray Bourque, who was one of my favorite players growing up, along with Cam Neely, Adam Oates, Joe Juneau. But to see him win a cup was very gratifying. Now, here's the thing. Joe Thornton became one of my favorite players in black and gold, and they really had a great chance of doing something special in 2003, 2004. They finished first place that season and had 104 points. They were set to play. They had loaded up as well. Michael Nylander, yes, William and Alex's father, Sergei Gonchar. They loaded up for that run, but unfortunately, they lost to the Montreal Canadiens in the first round of the playoffs. And part of that was blamed on Joe Thornton and his inability. I don't even think he recorded a point in that series. However, it came out later that he was playing with broken ribs. And of course, that led into the lockout that wiped out the entire 2004-2005 season. And he was needing a new contract around that time as well. And I remember it vividly. I got married in 2005. And we were going into Toronto for a Blue Jays game for part of bachelor festivities. And I remember hearing Joe Thornton signs a new contract with the Boston Bruins to keep him captain for the foreseeable future. Fantastic. However, as we remember, November 30th, 2005, the Bruins traded Thornton to the San Jose Sharks for Marco Sturm, Brad Stewart, and Wayne Primo. Thornton went on to win the Hart Trophy as the NHL's MVP that season while playing for the Sharks. Incredibly disappointing, incredibly disheartening. And I was super pissed at the Boston Bruins. In fact, that was my first foray into covering this team. I had a blog at the time, and I remember the headline, "Say It Ain't Joe." I heard about that trade, I believe, coming home from work one night. I was working at like a group home at the time. I came home, sat down, wrote about that trade, and that was kind of my beginning of hockey writing and getting into hockey coverage. Now, a few things were going on around this time as well. The Bruins, 2003, they drafted Patrice Bergeron, 45th overall. And I pictured, wow, Thornton, Bergeron for the foreseeable future, unbelievable. They drafted David Krejci in the second round in 2004. Thornton, Bergeron, Krejci, could you imagine that? Then the Joe Thornton trade happened. The Bruins kind of mailed it in that season. They finished 5th in the division, did not qualify for the playoffs, did not qualify the next year either, despite some pieces that were added. They drafted Brad Marchand in 2006. Milan Lucic was drafted around that time as well. They signed, of course, on July 1st, 2006, Marc, Savard, and Zdeno Chara signed at the exact same time. Savard provided critical offensive production for this team. Chara became the team's captain and key defensive leader. That was a huge moment in the history of the team. And then, of course, a few years later, they drafted Phil Kessel early on in the draft, and then traded him for 2 first-round picks, which became Tyler Seguin and Dougie Hamilton. They had significant impacts on the team's future. And that's when we began to see the next wave of success, which kind of kickstarted in 2008, 2009, where the Bruins finished first in the Eastern Conference. They did lose in the conference semifinals to the Carolina Hurricanes. I was living in Scotland that year, and I remember going to bed that night, Game 7, not knowing what was going to happen. I woke up the next morning. Somehow, I was able to access the TSN feed and watch the game. Spoiler-free, this was before I was on Twitter. And then, of course, watched as Scott Walker eliminated the Boston Bruins in that Game 7. But we know what happened from there. 2010, promising progress for the Bruins, losing in reverse sweep to the Philadelphia Flyers. The next year, of course, their first Stanley Cup final appearance since 1990. They won their first cup since 1972 by defeating the Vancouver Canucks in that 7-game series. Tim Thomas was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. 3 years later, the Bruins reached the finals, facing the Chicago Blackhawks. They lost that series in 6 games, but not without amazing performances from David Krejci, Tuukka Rask, who had been acquired by the Bruins in exchange for Andrew Raycroft, who I forgot to mention, who had won the Calder Trophy, flipped to Toronto for Tuukka Rask. Of course, that season featured the Bruins' incredible comeback against the Maple Leafs in Game 7 of the first round, overcoming that 4-1 deficit. And we kind of all know what happened from there. The Bruins missed the playoffs a couple of years. They fired Claude Julien, hired Bruce Cassidy, and that reign was culminated by a Stanley Cup final appearance in 2019. Third time since the 80s, facing the St. Louis Blues, losing in Game 7 on home ice. Just incredibly heartbreaking. Probably it was their last opportunity to win with that core of Chara, Bergeron, Rask, Krejci, Torrey Krug was part of that as well. And just incredibly disheartening. Now, through all that, well, we'll get to how I came to host this podcast amidst all that here as the podcast continues. All right, so how did I come to host this podcast? Where have we been and where are we going? Well, in the midst of all of this stuff going on with the Boston Bruins, it was shortly after the 2013 Stanley Cup Final that I was hired to work at The Score. The Score is a Toronto-based sports company that at the time or just before that, actually, they had a TV channel up here that scrolled highlights, had a ticker. That was bought by Sportsnet, and then they pivoted to focusing on the mobile app. Now have a betting angle to their business. But at that time, they were hiring a bunch of people to come on as news editors. And basically what I would do is aggregate news, write some stories for the app, populate the NHL feed, and we would, of course, send those out as alerts. So if you have the Score, when Jeremy Swayman re-signs, you'll get an alert on your phone. We would write those stories, put them on the app, send out the alerts. I did that for 5 years from 2013 to 2018. A lot happened during that time. I remember writing a feature on Peter Chiarelli being fired, I worked the night Milan Lucic and Dale Weiss had that infamous exchange in the handshake line. Got to do some other stuff like go down to the Hall of Fame and cover Marc being inducted along with Dave Andrewchuk. Went to Maple Leafs practice, interviewed William Nylander. Unfortunately, that period came to an end. It was a long, tough commute that I was involved in. And with the boys growing older, it was important for me to be more at home. When I left that job, I jumped into marketing. I really wondered whether I would do much hockey related again. As it happened, I jumped on with SB Nation. I offered to cover some junior hockey prospects that were related to, at the time, it was the San Jose Sharks. Then I jumped on and did the same for the Chicago Blackhawks. And through that, I was able to cover the 2019 run to the OHL championship by the Guelph Storm. Shortly after that, of course, that was when the Bruins lost to the Blues. It was a very bittersweet time in my hockey-loving life, covering this OHL championship in my town. Also, watching the Bruins lose in the final. I'm a Raptors fan. They won that year, so it was very up and down. Shortly after that, so I always kept kind of a foot in that game as well. I was really unsure whether I would do much in the hockey world. This opportunity came up to continue the hockey writing. I started kind of my own website through all that. And then 2019, Locked On expands into the hockey world. And I was able to reach out and got the gig. And here we are. We've been covering this team through the pandemic, COVID shortened season. I remember being in Niagara Falls when Tuukka Rask pulled out of the bubble, covering that. All the ups and downs over the past 5 years. Bruce Cassidy being fired, the incredible run, President's Trophy, devastating loss this past season, of course. And here we are looking ahead to 2024-25 and all the exciting things to come. We've lost Linus Ullmark, of course. There's big changes this offseason. We're waiting for Jeremy Swayman to be re-signed. And we are hopeful about the future of this team with some nice young pieces. Matt Poitras, of course. Matt Poitras played for the Guelph Storm. I was ecstatic when he was drafted. Thought I'd get to watch him more in Guelph after being drafted, but he made the team last year. That's very exciting. There's other young kids coming up. Fabian Lysell among them. John Beecher, Justin Brazeau, not super young, but an exciting guy that made an impact last season. All of this to say, I love the Boston Bruins with all my sports-loving heart. I am committed to this podcast as ever. I'm as committed to covering this team day in and day out as ever. Yes, I don't have boots on the ground in Boston, but we often have people come on. Bill Fraser from the Hockey News, Scott McLaughlin. We've had others over the years, Ty Anderson, Connor Ryan. I'm committed to having people from the local market come on and contribute. But I've been covering this team for 20 years. I've been watching this team for almost double that. And I feel I'm as qualified as anybody to talk about this team day in and day out here on Locked On Boston Bruins. That's what we do. We talk about our favorite team every day. Locked On Podcast Network. Very lucky, blessed to be part of this network. Some great people hosting other shows behind the scenes. And I'm excited about this upcoming season. Now, we're kind of going to decreased shows over the next month, 6 weeks, as we're in the dog days of summer. I'm going on vacation beginning tomorrow. So the next new episode will likely be next Friday. And then we'll do 3, maybe 4 episodes a week through August as we lead into training camp. Of course, if Jeremy Swayman signs anytime in the next few days while I'm away, I'll be sure to jump on and record a quick short on YouTube at the very least. So please do subscribe over there as well. Locked On Boston Bruins. subscribe in your favorite podcast feed. And I'm very excited about what's to come here in the future. Hoping to also reconnect with a former Bruin on the podcast who's been on a couple times already. So look out for that in August. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this Bruins origin story, where we've been, where we're going. Please do subscribe if you have not already. Very much appreciate all the love, the support, and looking forward to what's next here on Locked On Boston Bruins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your favorite team every single day. Take care, friends.